What's up everyone, welcome to the second tutorial in our Python language basics. Here we'll provide an intro into variables. We're going to spend some time in the slides learning about what variables are and how we can use them in Python. What we'll be covering here: first we'll give a general intro into what variables are and what they do for us in the sense of a program. We'll talk about what types of variable Python has and go over what each type will represent within a program. And then finally, we'll go over some quick examples. Now, we'll be spending our time in this tutorial in the slides. In the next tutorial, we're going to turn over to Google Colab and take a look at some real code examples. Okay, so keep that in mind. If you know exactly what variables are and what types are available in Python, feel free to skip this section. Otherwise, definitely stick around. For starters, what are variables and what do they do for us in the sense of a program? Well, variables simply act as placeholders for data. So they store values that can change throughout the program's execution. Essentially, we use these to store the state of a program as it runs. So for example, we might use variables to keep track of a player name, maybe a date, how many lives they have if they're playing a game, so on and so forth. So any data that we need to store will be done so in variables. Variables typically have a name, a type, and a value. Now, we can also assign the value of none if there's no specific value we want to associate with a variable. None is basically the equivalent of nil or null in other languages, just means a variable has no value. Otherwise, each variable will have a value based on the type of variable that we're dealing with. So let's get into the kinds of variable types available, and for starters, what are variable types? Variable types dictate the kind of data that a variable can hold. For example, are we dealing with numerical data, or is it going to be, let's say, like true or false data, or maybe text data? These are going to be dictated by the type of variable. Interestingly enough, Python is considered dynamically typed, which means that the types are very flexible and can change. This is not the case in, I'd say, most programming languages. Most programming languages are statically typed, which means once we assign a type, let's say a string or an int, whatever, to a variable, that cannot change. Not the case in Python. We can actually go maybe from text data to numerical data to true or false data at will. Okay, so this is one of the things that slows Python down a little bit, but it also helps make Python very, very flexible and easy to use. We can actually create custom types through the use of classes and objects, so that essentially expands the types available to an infinite number. But more on that once we talk about classes and objects. That'll be the final topic in our language basics. For now, we'll just be dealing with the basic types available in the standard Python library. We can also convert between most types as long as it makes sense. For example, if we're taking a numerical data, we can definitely turn that into text data. We can even turn it into true or false data. But let's say we have some text that's a name, maybe my name, Nimish. It doesn't really make much sense to turn that into a number. Now, the standard library types we'll see in Python will be bools or booleans, floats, ints or integers, and strings. We'll take some time in the slides to kind of go over each of these types, what they represent, and how we'd use them in code. I should say before moving forwards, when we're assigning a value to a variable in Python specifically, that's what dictates the type. Okay, we usually don't explicitly assign a type to a variable. That's definitely something you do in other languages. Not so the case in Python. We basically take a variable, assign it a value, and then that automatically assigns the type. Okay, so let's talk about booleans first, because these are by far the easiest and most simple data type. These are just a true or false representation of data, so they can basically take on one of two states. If they're not true, they're false, and if they're not false, then they're true. So it's either kind of one of the two. We can think about this as being binary. A binary state is something that's either essentially a 1 or a 0. It's either one state or it's the other, and it cannot be anything else. And so a good use for these will be when a variable can take on only one of two states, such as, let's say, an on or off switch. So if we're turning a light on, it's either on or it's off. I can't really be in the middle. I guess you could say if you attach a dimmer switch, then it's only kind of on, but realistically that's still on. So essentially we're using variables like booleans when there's only two possible states. These often store the results of the comparison operation as well. So let's say we're comparing two numbers. Is number 1 greater than number 2? If it's true or false, that will be stored in a Boolean variable as well. And so we'll often use these along with control flow to kind of dictate the flow of code, or which parts of the code we want to execute. Okay, next up we have ints and floats. These are both numerical data, but the difference between them is that integers are whole numbers, whereas floats are decimal numbers. Now this becomes kind of interesting in Python, where we're not specifically assigning a type, because if we assign, let's say, the value of 1 to a variable, then that will take on an integer type. But if we did 1.0, then it takes on a float type. And so it can be beneficial to explicitly assign a type sometimes. Otherwise, we kind of just let the compiler sort that out for us. Now, I should say there's also no native double type in Python. There are some libraries that have doubles, such as NumPy or Pandas, but we'll be dealing only with floats in native Python. Okay, doubles are something that exists in other languages. It's essentially another representation of a decimal number that has more precision, more decimal points, but not really something we deal with in Python. And finally, we have strings. So strings are by far the most interesting. They're used to represent text data. I say interesting because they're flexible. They can be basically any value between the double quotes or the single quotes. There's no distinction between these two in Python, as long as you're not combining them, say like one single, one double quote. It has to be both double or both single. In some languages, single quotes are used for just characters. I'm thinking specifically about Java or Swift, but not really the case in Python. It doesn't matter. So we use strings for names, messages, text data, basically anything that we're not going to be able to use a numerical type or a Boolean type to represent. But that being said, we can also use strings to contain text representations of numbers or true or false values. This will be very beneficial sometimes where we don't want, let's say, an integer or float type, but we do still want a number. Okay, we can use strings to represent that, same with true or false values. It should be said that we can convert anything we want to a string, well, within reason, but we cannot necessarily do the same backwards. Like I said in the previous example, if we have someone's name, it doesn't really make much sense to convert that to a number or a true or false, but if we have a string representation of a 1, absolutely we can convert that to an integer. Okay, so that is it for the basic types. Just a quick summary of what we covered. We talked about what variables are and the different types in Python. Variables are just a way to keep track of values or data within our program's execution. They essentially maintain the state. We have 4 basic types in Python. These are going to be our true or false values. Those are Booleans. It's going to be our numerical types. We use integers and floats. Ints for whole numbers, floats for decimal numbers, and finally we have strings. Those are going to be text-related data, anything between the single or double quotes. When we come back in the next section, we're going to be turning to Google Colab and looking at some examples of these variables in action with some real code examples. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching. See you guys in the next one. What's up, guys? Welcome to the third tutorial in our Python language basics. Here we're going to continue on with where we left off last time, talking about variables, but we're going to go over some examples of variables in action in Google Colab. So we're going to start just by creating different types of variables in Python so that we can get used to creating variables and assigning values and also determining the type of variables if for whatever reason we're not sure. This is a cornerstone to programming, so it's important that we get this down. We're going to start by working with Booleans or bool, integers or int, floats or float, and strings or string or str. So in the parentheses there, you can see the type as it would appear in Python. We'll basically just create some variables of each. We'll print out the value, print out the type, and so on and so forth. So let's turn on over to Google Colab and get started. So here you can see I've got a Google Colab notebook started up. I've called this one Python Language Basics, IPYNB. I would recommend that you get one started up yourself now or start up some other kind of Python environment where you can write and run Python code. Okay, good. So I'm assuming that you have your environment set up and can begin writing code. So I'm just going to zoom in a bit there. All right. So the very first thing we might want to do is create a Boolean variable. Before we even do that, let's talk about how to create variables in Python. So some languages will require you to do like a variable or a constant or something like that. That's not even necessary in Python. We just need a name and a value. Okay, it's as simple as that. We don't even have to assign the type. That is interpreted automatically by the compiler, although we can explicitly assign a type if we really want. Okay, so in, let's say in Python, the naming convention is typically to do if you have like two names for a variable. So we had some variable. Some languages will do this. In Python, it's better naming convention to do this. So separate your words with an underscore. It doesn't really matter too much. You can do camel case like this if you really want, but it's kind of better practice to do that in Python. It's a more accepted naming convention. Okay, cool stuff. So let's create a Boolean variable. Where might we see Booleans out in, let's say, a game? It's because I think for the examples, I'm going to stick with game development. Well, how about the most simple one? To determine if the game is running or not. Okay, so we might have some kind of condition, some variable that we're using to keep track of to tell if the game is over. So we can do something like is game over is going to be equal to false, or it's going to be equal to true. Okay, so let's set it as a false for now. And let's say we want to print out this value. Printing things out in Python is super easy. You just do the print, you call upon print function, and you put whatever you want to print between these parentheses. So we're going to do is game over. Okay, so let's go ahead and run that. Okay, it's just going to take a second. I'm just going to pause this, wait for it to finish. Okay, and it's finished running. It only took a few seconds, and you can see that's printed out false. That makes sense. We assign the value of false to the variable is game over using this assignment, and we're just printing it out. We can then print out, or rather reassign it and print it out later again. So we could say is game over is now going to be equal to true. Okay, we'll go ahead and print it out. Okay, and we'll run this again. Oops, we don't even really need to save it. We'll just go ahead and run the cell. So first we get false and then we get true. Makes sense because it was false here and we printed the value out. But then we changed it to be true and then we printed its new value. So each time we change the value, that is going to be the value it takes on throughout the rest of the code unless we change it again. Okay. Also, we can do something like is game over is equal to 5 greater than 6. Okay, what do you think this is going to be? Well, this should be false because 5 is not greater than 6. So let's go ahead and print it out once more. Okay, makes sense. We get false printed out there because we've taken on the value of a false assertion. So it's going to be false. Okay, so Boolean's fairly straightforward, just true or false values. Let's go ahead and create a new cell and let's talk about numerical data types. So again, these are going to be integers and floats. Integers are whole numbers, floats are decimal numbers. So where might we see these in code? Well, we might keep track of the number of lives something has. Those have to be whole numbers. We can't have like part of a life. Doesn't really make too much sense. So let's have a variable called number of lives, or num lives for short. And let's say we start out with 5 lives. Okay, we want to go ahead and print out num lives. We can. Let's go ahead and just run that cell there. And we should see 5 being printed out. Okay, so what about decimal numbers? Well, maybe we'll use decimal numbers to represent some kind of stat. So this could be maybe health, or it could be attack or defense. Realistically, in a real game, we'd probably use whole numbers for these, but let's just pretend that we would use decimal numbers, and let's just say something, you know what, maybe percent health makes a bit more sense. So we'll do like percent health, and we'll say it's going to be maybe 0.5, that represents 50% of our health bar. Okay, so then we go ahead and print out percent health. We can do so. Let's go ahead and run that cell. So we're printing out number of lives and then percent health there. So you can see 0.5. Again, important to note that this is assigned a whole number, so it's an integer type. This is assigned a decimal number, so it is a float type by default. I'll show you towards the end of this tutorial how to determine what the type of a variable is, but for now, let's cover strings and then we can get to that. So let's open up a new editor, or rather a new cell. Okay, so what about strings? We know that's anything between the double quotes here or the single quotes. Again, it doesn't really matter in Python, but you can't have one of each. You couldn't do this like that. That doesn't really make any sense. Okay, so what would we use a string for in a game? Well, how about any message we're printing to the screen? Or we can go even simpler. What about a player name? Okay, or even a character's name. For that, we should probably use a string. So I'm just going to say something like player name is going to be equal to, and then you can put your name there. I'll just put mine. Nimish, that's fine. I should note that this is not equivalent to this. These are very slightly different characters, the upper and lowercase. Just want to point that out. Okay, so just like with integers and booleans and floats, we can reassign values. So I can maybe say my player name later on, I'm changing players, is going to be equal to, I don't know, Mammoth or something like that. Okay, that's totally legitimate. Again, we can just print out the player name to see how it changes. Let's just copy that and we'll paste it in there. Okay, and you should see again the value changing as it does. Okay. And I guess just to demonstrate that we can use single quotes as well, I think I'll do that. We can paste it in there, and the cell should run just like before, no problems whatsoever there. Okay, so again, text, names, messages, etc., anything that's text related. All right, so the last thing I wanted to talk about is determining the type of a variable, and this is through the typeof function. Or actually in Python, it's actually just type. Okay, so most of the standard library stuff will turn a specific color. You see that this is part of a standard library, the print function. These are all particular primitive values. Type function is in blue, so it's not actually, in some languages it's typeof. Python is actually just type. So we can put type and then the name of the variable we're trying to determine. So we have booleans, integers, floats, and strings. Let's do one of each. So we can do is game over. Okay, and I'm just going to copy and paste that 4 times. Oh, actually, you know what? We should wrap these each in a print. So I'm just going to take that and do print, and there we go. Okay, so that will ensure that we're actually printing out the value each time. Okay, so we'll start with is game over. Then we can do number of lives and % health. So num lives. Then we'll do % health. Okay, and then finally the player name. Okay, good stuff. So let's go ahead and we'll just print that out. Just close it up. And you can see that these are class bool, int, float, and string. So just like I put in the parentheses, this is kind of the type of each of these. Okay. We'll talk about how to convert back and forth between types in the next section. But I just want to note that types are dynamic in Python. That's something that we talked about in the slides. So what if we do this? What if I said that the number of lives is now actually equal to some string representation of that number? So it's actually a string 5 rather than just the number 5. Well, now when I print out the type of number of lives, okay, I go to rerun the cell. Okay, so we get bool, int, float, string. That's good. That's what we expect. But now we get a string. So even though we first assigned it a numerical type, an integer, because we changed it to a different type of literal value, we're now also we're now seeing it change type to a string as well. Also, one final thing I should mention, I don't think we've covered this yet, we can actually reassign a value of another variable. So for example, if I wanted to say for whatever reason my new player name is going to be equal to the number of lives, I totally can. I can say something like player name is going to be equal to number of lives. It doesn't really make much sense in our context, but you can totally do that. It doesn't just have to be a literal value each time. We can reassign a variable value too. Okay, so that is it for now. What I'd recommend you do, because again, practicing and doing stuff yourself is the best way to learn coding, is to try some examples. So create maybe another variable of each type, another Boolean variable, a integer, a float, and a string variable. Maybe try printing them out, seeing what the types are. Try reassigning some values to them, literal and other variables. Again, keep printing out those types until you get really familiar with that. Once you're ready to move on, we'll talk about type conversion. Okay, so thanks for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one.